Have you ever done the right thing only to be rewarded with a swift kick in the pants? Well, if so, then you're going to relate to today's story, so I hope that you'll stay with us. Hi, I'm Louis Marsh, pastor of River Church in Parker, Arizona, and your host for this show, Tales from the Scrypt. Now, last week we began looking at the life of a major character in the Bible by the name of Joseph. And we saw how his being his father's favorite, well, it didn't quite work out for him the way that he and everybody else thought it would. Instead of taking command at the certain age that his father picked, he ended up being sold into slavery and sent off to Egypt. Now, Joseph must have been in shock when he was put up on the block to be sold. That's when it seemed like his luck may have changed, because he was bought by a wealthy and powerful man, very powerful man, named Potiphar. Now, there were four major sources of slaves in ancient Egypt. The first and by far the largest were prisoners of war. Many slaves were prisoners of war captured during military campaign. This was particularly true during Egypt's expansionary periods in the New Kingdom. Secondly, there were those deep in debt who either put themselves or some of their family members, like children very often, would be sold into slavery to pay off the family debt, or they were forced into slavery to pay it off. Third source was trade. Now, this is how Joseph became an Egyptian slave. And finally, you could inherit your parents' slaves. So if they had them, and you could get them when they passed away. Now, according to some ancient Egyptian papyrus, we know that foreign slaves were often bought and sold as what we might call today as, quote, skilled labor, unquote, while native Egyptian slaves were used for the unskilled work. Now, we'll have some more information on slavery in ancient Egypt in today's edition of Footnotes, so stay tuned for that. Potiphar could see that Joseph was educated and literate in his native language. We don't know exactly when he learned to read and write the incredibly complex Egyptian language, but it must have happened when he became a household servant of Potiphar. Joseph was smart, and the book of Genesis said that God blessed him in everything he did. Potiphar must have noticed this and made him a steward. Now, we know that this was a common practice in ancient Egypt. Potiphar didn't have the time, or perhaps even the skills or the interest, to supervise cultivating the land and all the other duties that came with running the house. He needed a steward, and Joseph, coming from an agricultural family, was perfect for that. This was critically important to Potiphar because ancient Egypt did not have a money economy as we know it today. And officials such as Potiphar were paid for their work by being allowed the use of vast swaths of farmland to grow more crops. So the young, skilled, and handsome Joseph prospered, and things finally seemed to be going his way. Sure, he was a slave, but he was a privileged one, and who knew what the future could hold for him? Well, as it turned out, his immediate future wasn't going to be very bright at all, because Potiphar's wife, who led the classic life of luxury, staying around the estate most of the time, began to take a liking to Joseph. He probably wasn't the first slave that she propositioned, and most likely wouldn't be the last either. However, he may have been the only one to risk everything by standing firm for what he believed to be right. She pressed him day after day to sleep with her, and day after day he remained strong and said no. He refused to betray his God or his master and her husband Potiphar that way. And the rest of the story you probably already know. More than 3,000 years before William Congreve memorialized the phrase, Joseph learned the truth that, quote, heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned, unquote. Now, we usually just paraphrase it to hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but you get the idea. Now, before going any further, I found it fascinating that there are several folk stories that grew up around Joseph, all stressing how irresistibly handsome he was. This theme of Joseph's extreme attractiveness to Egyptian women was then developed into a kind of defense of Potiphar's wife, in a new scene added to the story in Jewish and Muslim retellings. The Midrash Tanhuma, circa 8th century, depicts Potiphar's wife as expressing her desire for Joseph in public among her other Egyptian women who could sympathize. Our sages inform us that on one occasion the Egyptian women assembled and came to see how handsome Joseph really was. So what did Potiphar's wife do? Well, she gathered citrons and gave one to each woman, and she gave each one of them a knife. Then she summoned Joseph and stood him before them. When they saw Joseph's handsome countenance, they all cut their hands. She said to them, quote, "If this can happen to you, who see him only once, how much more so does it happen to me, who must look at him constantly," unquote. In this telling, Mrs. Potiphar's obsession with Joseph is quite public. She wants her peers to understand her lovesickness, and thus she throws a party to show off his beauty. A very similar account also appears in the Quran around the 7th century AD in a surah about Joseph. Now, back to the scriptures. You'll notice the scriptures here are much more tied into reality, and they're not making him so handsome that everybody just falls all over the place every time they sees him. You know, it's not like he's the only handsome guy in Egypt. Come on. Potiphar's wife lied to her husband, who in fury had Joseph thrown in jail. He was told that Joseph made the move on her, not the other way around. Now he could have killed him, but he didn't. And Joseph was put into prison where, according to Genesis, the Pharaoh's prisoners was kept. And that's important. This may surprise you, but many ancient cultures didn't have jails like we do. In the Old Testament, there were no jails mentioned at all in ancient Israel. Besides capital punishment, people usually either endured some form of physical punishment or they were banished, as Moses would be. We now know ancient Egypt did have at least one prison because of a papyrus translated in 1972. There's a prison mentioned called, quote, the place of confinement, unquote. It was divided into two parts, a cell block and a barracks. The cell block held a smaller group of prisoners, while the barracks held many. We know little about how people were sentenced. It seems that they stayed there until and unless Pharaoh or some other authority released them. The main prison was located at Thebes, modern Luxor, in Upper Egypt, some 400 miles south of the Nile Delta in modern Cairo. One of the chief assistants to the warden or the overseer of the prison was the, quote, scribe of the prison. In Genesis 39:22, we are told that Joseph was promoted to high office in the prison. Since Joseph was literate, it seems probable that he was promoted to the scribe of the prison. As such, he would not only have been the right-hand man of the warden, but he would also have overseen all the records of the institution. It was in that prison that dreams made another impact on Joseph's life. This time they came from two men, the Pharaoh's cupbearer, who tasted all the Pharaoh's food to make sure that it wasn't poisoned, and his baker, who had dreams that they didn't understand. So they came to Joseph, and Joseph offered to interpret them. While the cupbearer spoke, the baker listened quietly. He had dreamed of a vine with 3 branches, he said. It blossomed, and he squeezed the grapes into the Pharaoh's cup and put it into his hand. Joseph said this dream meant that in just 3 days he would be returned to serving Pharaoh. When the baker heard this encouraging news, he smiled and told Joseph that he had dreamed of 3 baskets full of bread. One basket was on his head and held food for Pharaoh, and birds were eating from it. And Joseph then, he had to tell the poor man that in 3 days Pharaoh would have him decapitated and hang his body from a tree. The poor baker was crushed, but hoped that Joseph was just another phony psychic. But 3 days later, Joseph was proven to be an accurate interpreter. The cupbearer was restored to his exalted position, and the baker, he was executed. The cupbearer was so filled with joy that he forgot the only request that Joseph made of him. In Genesis chapter 40, verses 14 and 15, Joseph says, "Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should put me in the pit." But When the cupbearer left prison behind, well, he left his memory behind as well, apparently, and Joseph stayed there, and the cupbearer seemed to forget all about him. Once again, Joseph had done the right thing, yet seemed to receive no reward. He remained stuck in what must have been a very terrible place and would remain there for 2 more long, bleak, dreary years. 2 years is a long time to wait. But in the end, Joseph would find out that while the cupbearer had forgotten him, God had not. And his plan for Joseph's life was still right on track. But that's next week's story. For now, remember that God never forgets and sees it all, so don't lose hope. Now, here's some footnotes. Welcome to this week's edition of Footnotes. Now, I said we were going to be kind of casual in footnotes. I don't know if I'm overdoing it. You can let me know. But I wanted to talk for just a couple of minutes here about slavery in ancient Egypt because it was a complex institution and very different in many ways from the better-known systems of slavery that have been had, like, say, the ancient Roman forms of slavery and slavery in the American South. So here's an overview of slavery in ancient Egypt. There were different roles and types of slaves. For example, there were domestic slaves. Now, these were the slaves that worked in the households of the wealthy, like Joseph, performing tasks like cooking, cleaning, etc. Then there were laborers. Many slaves were employed in agricultural work, particularly on large estates or in state projects like building temples, monuments, and of course, the pyramids. Then there were skilled workers. Now, some slaves possessed specialized skills and worked as craftsmen, scribes, and artisans. Joseph also could have been in that category. And then temple slaves. These were individuals who worked in the temples, often performing religious duties while maintaining the temple estates. Now, their living conditions varied widely, depending, of course, on who your master was. Domestic slaves and skilled workers usually had it better than the other guys, right? They were working for wealthy people, so their standard of living was usually a little bit better than the people that worked in the fields or on construction projects, but no one was put in a situation where they were apparently like beaten regularly and starving to death. I know that's the kind of the mental picture you have of the slaves building the pyramids, but modern archaeology indicates that's probably not true. Not that, they were treated like equals by any means, but they were fed and cared for pretty well. Now, slaves in ancient Egypt had some rights. For example, they could own property. They could get married to who they wanted to marry, and sometimes they achieved positions of influence, and some slaves could also earn their freedom. Now, the punishments for slaves, they were harsh. They included beatings, which were common for disobedient slaves, though the extent of the cruelty of that beating, of course, depended on the owner. They made a huge contribution to the economy of Egypt. They were essential to the workforce, contributing significantly to agriculture, construction, and, of course, the functioning of the households and the temples and the pharaoh's people and all that. Now, slaves were embedded in the broader social hierarchy, and they were, of course, on the lowest strata, but sometimes having the opportunity to rise within the ranks because of maybe they were very skilled, or maybe someone just took some pity on them or liked them, and so a wealthy person could help them move their way up. Slavery was regulated by law with specific provisions regarding the treatment, sale, and manumission of slaves. Manumission, there's your word for the day, MANUMISSION. Slaves could be freed by their masters as a reward for faithful service, or could purchase their own freedom if they'd accumulated enough money or resources. Freed slaves often retained a dependent relationship on their former owners. And then the historical context of slavery throughout ancient Egypt and the Old Kingdom, there's not a lot of evidence of slavery. Some is, but we don't really know too much about it. It appears to have been a form of debt slavery and of servitude to the state. Now, in the Middle Kingdom, increased trade and military campaigns led to a rise in the number of slaves. They, imagine you're capturing thousands of people after a battle, and all those people become slaves. You are suddenly going to have a lot more slaves than you used to. And then in the New Kingdom period, this is the period of Egypt's greatest expansion and saw another significant increase in the use of war captives as slaves, along with a more complex economy that utilized slave labor extensively. Now, I mentioned during this show that there were some folk traditions that had grown up around Joseph. And this is in the Quran. This is the Quran 12:30. And the Quran has stories of Bible characters, but they're stories that have been changed, and they're different. And this is an example of how I think you can tell this is not the actual real historical tale. Look, so let me just read it to you. Some women in the city said, "The wife of that mighty one has been trying to seduce her young man. He has her affected deeply with love. Surely we see that she is indeed clearly astray." And when she heard their cunning gossip, she sent for them and prepared a banquet for them and gave each one of them a knife. And then she said to Joseph, "Come forth to wait upon them." And when they saw him, they admired him, and they cut their hands and said, "God preserve us! This is no mere mortal. This is nothing but a splendid angel." Unquote. Well, I don't know about you, but I find that just a little hard to believe. Like I said, he's not the only good-looking guy in Egypt. Come on. So I think this is a good example of how you take a story and over time, as it changes from the original true story in the Bible, it gets a little more dramatic and a little carried away and a little, just harder to believe. So there you go. There's your footnotes for this week. If you got any questions or comments, be sure and let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe to this brand new baby channel, because we need your help. So until next time, take care. God bless you. And Lord willing, I'll be right back here next week.